Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Caroline Webb. I will tell you all about Caroline in just a moment. This LinkedIn Live show, Grace Under Pressure, is all about the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. What's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, when it really isn't. It's really the hard stuff. And when you do it as a leader, as you will definitely discover that Caroline Webb is, you do it with the purpose of bringing people together. Caroline Webb, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
Great. Well, I want to tell folks all about you. You're an executive coach, author, and speaker with a McKinsey pedigree. And I think you're the only coach I know that has a McKinsey pedigree. And you have a book, a wonderful book, called How to Have a Good Day. And it is a gem. There is so much stuff in this book that we're only going to scratch the surface, but it's well worth it. So you have been hailed by Forbes as it was hailed by Forbes as a must-read business book. I agree wholeheartedly. And it's, someone described it in Fortune as self-improvement through data. I like that stuff. So you've also won awards from Financial Times, Time Magazine, and Cosmopolitan. You are a senior advisor to McKinsey and an executive coach. Welcome aboard, Caroline Webb.
Thank you, John.
Great. So you're an accomplished consultant. Why write a book about behaviors? My perception is that you're a strategist, but what have I got wrong?
Well, I was actually at McKinsey focusing on leadership and organizational change. And within that, organizational behavior. I'd had a first career as an economist, and I was interested in economics as a human science, a sort of way of thinking about how to be at our best, often as countries and regions and so forth. And I went to McKinsey to focus on a smaller unit of the organization, the team, and eventually the individual leader. So I was doing a lot of work on leadership and change, and I just came across a lot of really smart, interesting people who were nevertheless worn down and exhausted. And because of my technical background, I found that by using behavioral science, whether that's behavioral neuroscience, psychology, or economics, I could help them see how they might create the conditions to optimize high performance in their brain. And that was a way to talk to quite analytical, technical people about how they might thrive, how they might excel. And so that's where the roots of the book came from, because I was doing that work for about 15 years, and then out popped the book.
Well, this is a hefty tome, so nothing popped. This is
15 years is not an exaggeration.
Yeah, really significant labor of love, but blood, sweat, and tears. I can tell from the heft of this book. So we talked beforehand, and we spoke. Let's focus on a few key points. So, because you told me there's over 100 action-oriented tips in here. We're just going to highlight 7, which I think cut to the heart of the book and more. And the first one is priorities. Now, everybody says set priorities. So what's stopping us from doing it, Caroline? Why do you even have to write about it?
Well, the thing I specifically end up spending a lot of time on is setting priorities for your attention, because our attention is the currency of our lives. It's where we focus, it's what we notice, it's what we experience, and we only have a limited stock of it. And we don't know what we don't know. We're only able to perceive a small part of reality at any given time, and our brain kind of fills in the rest, gives us the impression that we're seeing everything, but we're not. We're only experiencing a tiny part of reality at any given time. And there is a little rule that your brain uses to decide what's important enough for you to notice, and it's basically whatever's on your mind now. So what's on your mind now shapes what your brain decides you should notice next. And that's why our grandmothers always used to say, that we got out of bed on the wrong side, because if you start in a bad mood, your brain will look for things that confirm that the world is a really annoying place. And so, that really matters a lot for us as professionals, because we get into vicious circles or virtuous circles, depending on where our state of mind starts. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I talk a lot about setting priorities for your attention. It's not that you can ignore the bad stuff. It's just that you might need to say, okay, well, in this meeting, even though I think it might be a little bit of a stressful or annoying meeting, where do I want to put my attention? I want to look for opportunities for collaboration, for example, or opportunities to show appreciation. Then you're much more likely to notice those with your tiny limited stock of confidence. And that might
Yes, I thought of something. When I think of priorities, I usually think of a to-do list or a list of intentions and stuff.
Yeah.
And then but what about people? Do we all say we prioritize people as kind of pablum? But should we as individuals prioritize relationships within the work environment? What's your take on that?
I mean, one of the most reliable ways to give ourselves a boost, the research has shown this really clearly, is to interact with other people, even if you're introverted by preference. Research suggests that even small interactions with what they call weak ties, random people when you're picking up coffee, just to say, oh, I like your music, or I like your hat. Just that sense of human connection, even with people who don't know that well, has been shown to give us a really reliable boost. And the same goes for being generous and kind to other people. That's one of the surest ways. Marty Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology, is on record as saying that that's probably the quickest way you can give yourself a mental boost, is to give compliment or be kind or generous to someone else. So yeah, absolutely. People should be on our to-do list every day, but specifically being kind to people.
Yeah, I might call that a moment of grace.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
No, I mean, our work really joins up in this.
That's great. The next thing with priorities is productivity. Again, you talk about batch your tasks, not rocket science, okay? But if we batch our tasks, does that prevent us from shifting priorities or, quote, being spontaneous? So
yeah, so the argument here is that if you're asking your brain to switch from let's say, we're talking now, but maybe I'm sort of reading something out of the corner of my eye, and maybe I'm looking at my watch, we think that we're gracefully splitting our attention across all of these things, but actually we're asking our brain to work very, very hard in bouncing around like that. So of course we like variety. Of course we want to have a few different sparky things to light up our day, that give us different ideas, different modalities of working. But if we're asking our brain to do that every couple of seconds, which we basically are if we have our phone pinging or our notifications buzzing, then that's a heavy lift for our brain, because our brain can actually only do one thing at a time consciously. So that's just shift your focus from time to time throughout the day, but just not time to time within a minute. Right.
And I think it's kind of, I would use the word distraction, and it's only becoming more acute because the proliferation of media, or your phone, whatever, it's always on and people look at it. And I'm certainly not immune from that at all. And so
I work very hard at it, by the way. I mean, I have a little timer on my desk just to kind of say, okay, I'm going to stay focused for this number of minutes. And then I treat myself to checking messages in between.
Get that hit of dopamine.
There you go. There you go. Social connection. Right.
Now, you touched on this before, but it's worth exploring because it's so important, and that's relationships. So, and as you said, show appreciation. So how do we really come across as genuine other than faking it? Or is it okay to fake it?
I think, everything we know about emotional contagion suggests that people can tell when it's not real, actually. But I think that there's a piece of advice that I generally give here, which works in two different ways. One, the advice is to be very, very specific in the thing that you're praising. And that works both because it makes sure that you can say something really authentic. You may not be able to say, I love your work, but you might be able to say, I really appreciate the effort that you've put into this, even if you don't actually like the outcome.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, specific praise, though it sounds narrower, actually is more likely to register with people because we process specifics more than generalities or abstractions. So what I mean is, for example, if I say, oh, John, you're great, you're great, you're great. It sounds
I already know that. I mean, that's
broad
good.
And, lovely. But if I say to you something like, Now, let me think. I really appreciate the way that you bring music into your work, because it gets everybody who sees you play the piano into a different frame of mind very quickly. And that's a brilliant way of sparking new ideas and new thoughts. And it happens really reliably, even when people don't know the song. Now, what are you going to remember?
Yeah.
Right, you're going to remember the specific praise that shows that I really saw and noticed what you did. And that sounds, to your point, very authentic, because I'm talking about the effect that it had on me. So specific praise is the way forward.
Right. And I think that what the specificity is that you picked out an attribute that the person that you're commenting on or praising is proud of. And so, for example, me, I'm proud that I dabble in music. It's a big thing. It's my hobby. I enjoy it. So that tweaks me. And so, but that's when knowing something, a fact or an attribute of an individual really helps you hone in on that. Am I correct? So
yeah, absolutely. And you can do that much more frequently during the day than most of us do. One can say, I really like the way you said that thing to that person in that meeting, because it had that effect that was not happening before. Just to be more fluid about giving that kind of specific praise, it's really what we tend to hear more and remember more. And so it's good to get into the habit. That's something I work with leaders on all the time.
Okay, I like that thing. And we're in the positive now. So what happens when we have to give constructive feedback about, Caroline, you're not doing your job? So how would you approach that? So.
It's actually, I mean, in a way, it's elegant, because it's the same piece of advice, to be as specific and factual as you can. When you're calling someone out on some behavior that wasn't ideal, if you say, instead of saying you're terrible, that was awful, you never handle yourself well in meetings. If you say specifically, what happened was that we'd said that we wanted you to speak for 5 minutes and you spoke for 12, and that really threw off the cadence of the whole meeting and made it hard for us then to, that's a different, it feels less personal. And it is much easier to then deal with. And also it allows you to solve the right problem, because you might assert that the person is doing, is sort of talking at length because, they're being selfish, but maybe they're just nervous, and you're not making any assumptions about what's behind the behavior.
Is it, when one has to give critical feedback, is it good to begin with a positive affirmative, like, I know I like the work effort that you're putting in, let me give you some feedback about X. Does that help or not?
Well, I think this has become much maligned as the polite way of calling it is the praise sandwich. There are less polite ways of describing it.
Yeah.
Now, I actually think, yes, I do think the more specific you can be about things that you appreciate, the more you earn the space to talk about specific things that the person could do better. So I actually do think it's worth, and it's also worth having a lot of praise that doesn't then follow with, but here's one thing I'd like you to do differently, right. So that the person, doesn't always think that every time they're getting a piece of praise that they're conditioned then to hear something bad immediately afterwards. So that takes some work and some deliberate effort.
And there's a bit of connective tissue to this, I think, and that's just, you use the word relationship. So when I give praise or when I give constructive feedback or feedback in general, I'm engaged with that individual on an ongoing basis. Yeah. That makes a difference, does it not, Caroline? So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a sense of social capital and trust that you're building between each other, so that if your boss is saying, I just want to have a quick chat with you about the meeting just there. I really like the way that you did X. What would make me like it even more is if you did Y. And the reason for that is, then you've got the sort of container around it, which feels like, oh, this person's interested in my development. So for sure, this is something that builds up over time. But if you find yourself having to give, developmental negative feedback to someone that you don't have that relationship with, then being very precise about what you appreciate first, and then being very specific and factual about the observation that you're calling them out on, without interpretation or generalization, that's the way forward.
That key point. Now, you have another priority. I think there's far too less of, and I'll throw myself in here, and it's called thinking. Now, you have a methodology for this.
You do plenty of thinking, John.
No, I think, and seriously, for executives, I don't know that they have enough time to think, and I don't know that it's been prioritized enough. Perhaps that's just my observation, because they're busy, they're doing, they're making, whatever. So you have something called a pre-mortem. Explain what that means.
Well, to be clear, I borrowed that from Gary Klein. The concept of the pre-mortem addresses something which is true for all of us, you, me, everybody who's listening. Which is that our brain is always taking shortcuts. It's always looking for ways to reduce the load on our brain. So if there's an easy answer, then it will always go to that. And, you know, that is the basic mechanism that sits behind every cognitive bias you've ever heard of. You know, confirmation bias. Well, I'm looking for evidence that confirms my expectations and my, and assumptions, because, well, that's a lot easier than challenging them, and so on. So what you want to do when you're taking an important decision is, you know, just to recognize those shortcuts are helpful when you're making easy decisions about what you're going to have for lunch. But if you're making an important decision, you want to make sure that you're widening your perspective enough to make sure that your brain isn't making silly shortcuts. And so the pre-mortem does that by saying, okay, you're borrowing the wisdom of hindsight. You put yourself a year from now, you say, the decision you were making went badly wrong. What was it you did so badly wrong, Caroline? What was it that we messed up, John? And just that fact of putting yourself in a different mental space has been shown to give us a little bit of the wider aperture, the wider perspective that we need when we're wanting to be really wise in taking decisions.
That's great. And I like that future planning, thinking, posting ahead. I mean, it's a form of scenario planning, and then working backwards. But just the emphasis on thinking, I'm so glad you called it out, because seriously, I think we're so conditioned to do, which is the American management model, that we don't spend enough time thinking. Have you encountered that, Caroline?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a leader that I coach that has ever come to me and said, I've got plenty of time to reflect. I do all this strategic thinking that I like, you know, in the week. It's almost always a theme is, you know, the feeling of running from one thing to the next and being very stretched, and often being involved in tasks that could be delegated, and, you know, having a calendar that's too fragmented. So absolutely getting time to think and time to reflect, and creating space for that in a weekly calendar is something that I think every client, I think every one of us works on. So yeah, for sure.
You said something very important there that gets back to your other point. And you said an executive's time is fragmented, or I'd say pushed and pulled in different directions. So if we plan out our schedule when possible, we could batch those tasks, as you had said, but also batch the people that we're working with too, the same team. Is there any value in that, Caroline?
Well, I think anything that you can do to create less, at least, you know, a few blocks of time each week that are not full of distractions, the better. And then when you're with your team, you know, by extension, actually not to be distracted and to be fully present in turn. So it's certainly not that I'm saying that you don't have a lot of stuff going on in your week. It's just, instead of being in a state of continuous partial attention, to be stepping fully into something and fully out, fully in and fully out. And that includes giving yourself time to think and reflect.
No, that's very important. And if you do that well, that will give you something, your next point, which is influence. You talk about humanizing your message. So how does that play out, humanizing the message? So.
Our human brains are wired to pay particular attention to human stories, human faces, even. And that's the same, you know, whether your work is, you know, as a bookkeeper or as an artist. It's we are wired to have an extraordinary upsurge of mental energy when we're presented with a face. And, that face can be a virtual face if it's in a story. And so if you think about, the way that someone tries to persuade you of the case for perhaps, making an investment, typically they'll have a bunch of numbers on a page. And it's not to say, obviously you want your numbers to add up, and for the, the business, you want to have done your good thinking and your pre-mortem and make sure it all makes sense. But the way to get people over the hump of the nervousness of, well, should we do this, is most likely to be a combination of numbers and saying, if we do this, imagine what would be different for, there's a story that I remember sticking in my mind. A CEO who was running a hospital, and the focus of the work that he was driving through the hospital was a focus on patient dignity. And he was telling stories about what it felt like to be treated with dignity or not. And there was one time he came on stage to do a big town hall, and he was wearing a hospital robe that was open at the back. And people from the front couldn't see that he actually did have his underwear on underneath.
Yeah.
But he was making a visual point of what it was like to be wandering around the hospital, with your bottom hanging out, and flapping around. And now, of course, what they do is they have you put a robe on like this and then a robe on the other way so that you feel more protected, right, and so forth. But, honestly, there was nothing that connected people's sense of the importance of patient dignity to the work that they were doing more than him talking about what it felt like to be that patient who was not feeling, that they were perhaps being looked after from a dignity point of view.
That is a powerful image. And when one puts on that hospital gown, it's I don't want to say dehumanizing, but it's an infantilizing in a way. Infantilizing, I think might be the word. You don't feel
thinking, well, how do I bring this to life? How do I make people see that there's a real person here?
And what a great image that speaker made at that point. That's brilliant. That's really
I'm not
brilliant.
saying everybody has to do that, but if you can tell the story, imagine you're the guy walking down the corridor, and you've got your
That's funny. Now we're getting to a key point as we're all motoring through this, and I think this great pandemic, and as hopefully we're looking at it in the rearview mirror mostly, the topic of resilience has come up. So you talk about, for resilience, it's important to get distance. What did you mean by that, and why does it matter?
Well, when we think about resilience, what we're talking about really is a brain that is under threat. So is perceived to kind of threaten the environment and is launching a fight or flight response to that. And that feeling of threat can come from, not just someone, a car speeding towards you, but, psychological threats like a feeling of lack of self-worth or social standing. And, that feeling of proximity to the threat might be, in some ways very virtual. You might just be left off an email chain and feel excluded. You might be working on a new project and be well out of your depth and feeling really incompetent. If you can get some distance by saying, okay, let me put on someone else's hat. Before we were talking about, well, let's imagine ourselves in the future getting some distance and looking at this. But it could also be, let me imagine that I'm in the shoes of the wisest person I've ever known. Maybe I'm pretending to be John Baldoni. What would John say about this? And just that small amount of, I knew, just that small amount of distance, or even what would my best self say to me about this? Or even what would I say about this when I look back on this and laugh about it next week? Just these small amounts of distance can remove ourselves from the immediate proximity of the thing that's threatening us and allow us to think about what we do now.
And you would know this because I know that you are a singer in a choral group, and you have performed at Carnegie Hall, which is pretty gosh darn cool. But when it gets to resilience, I'll tell you who masters this, and you know this: actors. Because their lives are constant rejection in the sense of not getting a part, and and it's nothing. It may be nothing to do with their talent, but how they look or how present or whatever, which is unique to them, but it's not, quote, right for the part. So I might use that analogy if that makes sense to you. So.
Oh, absolutely. And, the famous composer Ben Zander always used to teach his musicians that when they made a mistake, it was a fascinating opportunity for learning. And that was a beautiful way of giving someone some sense of distance and perspective in that heat of the moment. He actually used to get his players to put their arms up and say, "How fascinating, what can I learn from this?" And
Right.
there are, hundreds of executives around the world who've now been exposed to me telling them that's a good thing to do in the heat of the moment. And so we have a shared language of how fascinating.
How fascinating. Okay.
What a fascinating problem right now.
There's one more point, I think, and it's maybe what you also began your studies with, and it's energy. And burnout, sadly, continues to be an even greater issue than when you wrote this book. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better. So what advice do you have of self-energizing? So,
if there's one thing that you can do, it's to echo what we started talking about at the beginning, which is being deliberate about where you put your attention. And specifically in this case, at the end of each day, to say, what were the good things that happened today? Because our brain is naturally tuned to pay more attention to things that seem threatening, because that's historically kept us safe. And it's very easy for us to completely forget the things that have happened that have been more positive. And so there's a deliberate reshifting of attention that you can do towards the end of each day. And that really matters actually to do at the end of the day. It's a good habit at any point in the day. Right. But at the end of the day, because of something called the peak end effect in behavioral economics, where the way that we rate the quality of an experience is disproportionately affected by the way that it ends. This has been shown in a number of different, funny studies and serious studies. And so ending on a high is not a bad idea, it turns out. And if you've had not a great day, can't necessarily just magic up a wonderful memory, but you can stop and think, okay, what was good? And that's actually one of the steady habits that I and my husband have, is to sort of do that review at the end of every day. And sometimes, we have to really think, oh yeah, okay, well, no, there was that nice post on that LinkedIn. There was a nice comment on the post, or you really have to kind of go back and think, okay, that's something I want to hold on to.
That's good. I remember my daughter is now grown and mother of 2 kids, which happened to be our grandsons. So she was a diver. And when she was a teen, she had a coach who always had his divers do a dive they had mastered at the end. So they would end on a high note. So that's what you're talking about. And that's important.
There's real scientific evidence behind that. It changes the way we remember a day.
And being specific, because this book, I want to just give another shout out to how to have a good day. While this is loaded with research, there's a lot of practical things in here, exercises to do. So you can read it cover to cover, which I recommend, but you can also skim it. And there are appendices and lots of great pointers in that, which leads me to one other thing you're doing. Tell us about your brand new course on LinkedIn.
Oh, thank you for asking. Yeah, I've just published my second LinkedIn learning course, which is called Science-Based Habits for Modern Leadership. So if you're in any kind of management role or stepping into one or hoping to, this is going to be a slant on a lot of things we've been talking about, specifically, if you're leading and inspiring other people, that will be relevant for you. So I hope you have a fun time checking it out. And then the other course is How to Have a Great Day at Work, which is
great,
squarely in this territory.
We'll put that in the notes too. So wonderful. Now, as you know, Caroline, I ask every guest a story about grace. Is there one that you would wish to share with us? So
yeah, I mean, when I think of grace as it applies in my own life, health often comes to mind, and the need to have a degree of grace in dealing with health issues. I spent a lot of the first half of this year dealing with the aftermath of having COVID 3 times last year. And actually it reminded me of the previous time that I had a post-viral syndrome, which was 2003 or so, and I was off sick for, I was pretty sick for 2.5 years. And a lot of the work that we've talked about today stemmed from that interest of really trying to see how can we be our most productive, our most brilliant selves, even when things aren't really going that well. So there's a realism that came from that experience that I had, which is, not to compare yourself with other people, because who knows what they're dealing with. You are where you are. Do the best you can. Be the best version of yourself you can, and focus on the things that matter, which is showing love to people and leaving the world a better place. And so that really emerged from those, that 2.5 years, and it's really come back into the fore of my mind, with the last 6 months not being so great health-wise.
Great. Well, what a great story about grace and good health we know of, but emerging from it from a health challenge, which is debilitating over time, particularly when it persists. So what a powerful story. And you got a great book out of it, or at least in the beginning of a book out of it. Caroline, you spent such a wonderful time to speak to you today. So how can people find you?
Best place to find me is my website, which is carolinewebb.co. That's .co, not .com. There are lots of Caroline Webbs in the world. carolinewebb.co, and you can find resources and tools and newsletters there. And then, of course, come and follow me on LinkedIn and find those courses if that's of interest to you.
It's been a joy to speak to you today. And with that, we're going to go out. Thank you.